Because what I'm about to say might break an illusion you've been living in for years. Most people don't even realize they're in a toxic relationship. They don't see it. They feel something is wrong, but they can't explain it. And the scariest part, toxic relationships don't always look toxic. They don't always come with shouting or obvious abuse. Sometimes they come with smiles, with I love you, with moments that make you question your own reality. So let me show you the truth, the 5 signs that you are in a toxic relationship. And once you hear them, you won't be able to unsee them. When you don't feel relaxed after talking to them, you feel drained, like something inside you has been quietly pulled out without your permission, and you can't even explain why, because nothing big happened, no fight, no explosion, just a slow, invisible leak of your energy that leaves you staring at the ceiling at night, replaying conversations that should have been simple, wondering why your chest feels heavy around someone who claims to love you. You know, you start noticing that your peace disappears the moment their name appears on your phone. Your heartbeat changes, your mood shifts, and instead of excitement, there's tension, like your body already knows something your mind is still trying to deny. And the scariest part is you begin to normalize this feeling, telling yourself this is what love looks like, this constant emotional fatigue, this quiet exhaustion that follows you everywhere. You know, you used to trust yourself. You used to know when something felt right or wrong, but now you hesitate. Now you pause before speaking. Now you analyze your own emotions as if they're crimes that need justification, because somewhere along the way, their voice became louder than your inner voice. And now every time you feel hurt, a second voice inside you whispers, maybe it's just you. Maybe you're the problem. Do you catch yourself apologizing for things you didn't do, shrinking your opinions, softening your truth, editing your personality just to avoid conflict? And slowly, without any dramatic moment, you start disappearing, not physically, but psychologically, until one day you look in the mirror and realize you don't fully recognize the person staring back at you anymore. You know, they don't need to shout to control you. They don't need to threaten you, because the control is quieter, smarter, almost invisible. It comes wrapped in concern, and I just want what's best for you, in subtle disapproval that makes you question your choices, until you stop doing things not because they told you directly, but because you already know how they'll react, and you'd rather avoid that discomfort than deal with it. Your world starts getting smaller, not overnight, but piece by piece. You talk less to certain friends, you stop sharing things, you avoid situations that once made you happy, and you tell yourself it's normal. That relationships require sacrifice, but deep down you feel it, that uncomfortable truth that this isn't growth, this is restriction. This is you slowly being shaped into someone easier to manage. You know, and then there's the silence, the kind that feels louder than words, where you're sitting next to them but feel completely alone, where conversations become surface level, where your deeper thoughts stay locked inside because you've learned they won't be received. And that loneliness hits differently, because it's not the loneliness of being by yourself, it's the loneliness of being unseen by someone who is right there. You begin to crave connection in a relationship that is supposed to provide it. You miss being heard, you miss being understood, you miss being able to just be without overthinking every reaction, every tone, every possible misunderstanding. And it creates this internal conflict where you're physically present but emotionally distant, constantly battling between staying and wanting something more real. You know, but what keeps you there is not what's happening now, it's what happened in the beginning. The version of them that made you feel special, seen, chosen, the moments that felt perfect, and your mind keeps going back to that, using it as evidence that this situation can still be saved, that if it was real once, it can be real again, and that belief becomes the chain that holds you in place. You start making excuses for them, justifying behavior you would never accept from anyone else, telling yourself they're just going through something, that they didn't mean it, that things will get better. And every time you say that, you move a little further away from reality and a little deeper into hope, a hope that feels comforting but quietly keeps you stuck. And the truth is, hope in this situation doesn't heal you, it traps you, because it keeps your focus on potential instead of patterns, on promises instead of actions, on who they could be instead of who they consistently show themselves to be. And that gap between expectation and reality is where your pain lives. You know, you become patient in ways that slowly destroy you, tolerant of things that go against your values, understanding to the point where you stop understanding yourself. And all of it feels like love, all of it feels like effort, but in reality, it's you stretching yourself beyond your limits for someone who isn't meeting you halfway. There's a moment, quiet but powerful, where you realize you've been trying to fix something that was never yours to fix, that you've been carrying emotional weight that doesn't belong to you, that you've been sacrificing your peace in the name of love, and that realization is uncomfortable because it forces you to confront the possibility that the relationship itself is the problem. And once you see it, really see it, you can't unsee it, because every drained feeling, every moment of self-doubt, every silent night, every controlled decision, every excuse you've made starts connecting like pieces of a puzzle, forming a picture that is hard to accept but impossible to ignore, a picture that shows you that what you've been calling love has been quietly hurting you all along. Two, you didn't notice the moment it started, because it never begins with something obvious. It begins with something small, almost harmless, a comment that makes you pause for a second, a reaction that feels slightly off, a sentence that leaves you thinking longer than it should, and you brush it off because you trust them, because you believe in them, because you never imagined you would have to question yourself in a place where you expected to feel safe. You used to speak freely without rehearsing your words in your head, without calculating how they might respond, without worrying that your feelings would be turned against you. But now every sentence feels like a risk. Every opinion feels like something that needs to be filtered, and you start choosing silence over expression because silence feels safer than being misunderstood or dismissed. First, it confuses you because you know what you felt, you know what happened, you know your intentions were clear, but when they respond with your overthinking, or that's not what I meant, or you always take things the wrong way, something inside you hesitates, something inside you begins to question your own perception, and that hesitation grows stronger every time it happens. You begin to replay moments in your head, not to understand them, but to verify them, to confirm that you didn't imagine it, that you didn't exaggerate it, that you're not the problem. But the more you think about it, the more blurred everything becomes, because their version of reality starts mixing with yours, and you no longer know which one to trust. You find yourself apologizing even when you're hurt, saying sorry just to restore peace, just to end the tension, just to avoid another conversation where your feelings are minimized, and every apology that doesn't belong to you slowly chips away at your self-respect, quietly teaching you that your emotions are less important than keeping things calm. But, you start doubting your reactions, wondering if you're too sensitive, too emotional, too complicated, because that's what you've been told, directly or indirectly, and instead of questioning why you feel this way, you begin questioning whether you're allowed to feel this way at all. The strongest part of you, the part that once trusted your instincts, begins to weaken because every time you listen to it, it gets challenged, dismissed, or corrected, and eventually you stop listening altogether, replacing your inner voice with theirs, letting their perspective define your reality. You begin to seek their approval for things that never required approval before. Simple decisions suddenly feel heavy, like they need validation, like you can't rely on your own judgment anymore. And this shift is so subtle that you don't even realize how much power you've given away until you feel incapable of deciding without their input. You question your memory, your tone, your intentions, your entire interpretation of events, and it creates this constant mental loop where you're trying to prove your own reality to yourself, trying to hold on to a sense of truth that feels like it's slipping through your fingers. There are moments where you feel something strongly, where your gut tells you that something is wrong, but instead of trusting it, you pause, you analyze, you second guess, because you've been conditioned to believe that your instincts are flawed, that your feelings are unreliable, that your perception cannot be trusted without external confirmation. You become hyper aware of how you come across, adjusting your behavior to avoid being labeled as difficult or dramatic, softening your tone, minimizing your needs, downplaying your concerns, and all of it creates a version of you that feels controlled, restricted, and disconnected from who you truly are. And the more you adjust, the more you lose, because every time you silence your truth, every time you ignore your intuition, every time you choose their version of reality over your own, you move further away from yourself, further into a space where your identity feels uncertain, where your confidence feels fragile, where your sense of self begins to fade. You start asking yourself questions you never had to ask before, wondering if you're really as capable as you thought, if your feelings are valid, if your perspective holds any weight. And these questions don't come from within you, they come from repeated exposure to doubt, planted and reinforced over time. The most dangerous part is that it doesn't feel like control. It feels like confusion. It feels like you're just trying to understand, just trying to improve, just trying to make things work. And while you're busy fixing yourself, you don't realize that the foundation itself is what's unstable. Fear. There's a quiet fear that develops, a fear of being wrong, a fear of misinterpreting, a fear of expressing something that might be invalidated, and that fear keeps you cautious, keeps you restrained, keeps you from fully showing up as yourself. You begin to disconnect from your own emotions, not because you don't feel them, but because you don't trust them, and that disconnection creates a kind of emptiness where you're no longer fully present within your own experience, where your internal world feels uncertain and unreliable. And somewhere deep inside, there's a part of you that knows this isn't how it's supposed to be, that questions why you feel this way, that wonders why something that should feel safe feels so destabilizing. But that voice is quieter now, overshadowed by doubt, by confusion, by the constant need to question yourself instead of trusting yourself. You weren't always like this, you weren't always unsure, you weren't always hesitant, you weren't always questioning your worth and your reality, and recognizing that difference is uncomfortable because it forces you to confront how much you've changed, how much you've adapted, how much of yourself you've slowly let go of without even realizing it. 3, you sit next to them, close enough to feel their presence, close enough to hear their breathing, close enough to convince anyone watching that everything is fine. But inside you feel a distance that no physical closeness can fix, a silence that stretches far beyond the space between two people, a quiet emptiness that keeps growing no matter how near they are. You try to talk, you try to share something real, something meaningful, something that matters to you, but the response you get feels shallow, distracted, disconnected, like your words landed somewhere far away from where they were supposed to be received. And in that moment, you realize it's not that you have nothing to say, it's that there's no space for your voice to truly exist. You begin to hold things in, not because you want to, but because you've learned what happens when you don't. You've seen how your feelings get brushed aside, how your thoughts get misunderstood, how your vulnerability doesn't feel safe in their hands, and so you start choosing silence, not as a preference, but as protection. The conversations become shorter, lighter, less real, filled with surface-level exchanges that never touch the depth you crave, and every time you stay on that surface, a part of you sinks deeper into loneliness because you're starving for connection in a place that looks like it should be feeding you. You remember how it used to be, how easy it once felt to open up, how natural it was to be yourself, how you didn't have to measure your words or filter your emotions, and that contrast makes the present feel even heavier because you know what connection feels like and you know this isn't it. You start feeling like a stranger in your own relationship, like someone who is present but not truly seen, like someone who exists beside them but not with them. And that realization doesn't come all at once. It builds slowly through moments where you feel unheard, through times when your presence feels unnoticed, through silence that says more than words ever could. You laugh together, you spend time together, you might even share routines, but something essential is missing, something that can't be replaced by proximity or habit, something that has to do with being understood at a deeper level. And without it, everything starts to feel hollow, like you're going through the motions of a connection that no longer reaches your heart. You begin to question yourself again, wondering if you're asking for too much, if your need for emotional connection is unrealistic, if maybe this is just how relationships become over time. And these thoughts keep you from acknowledging the truth that what you're feeling is not too much, it's just unmet. There are moments when you want to say everything, when you're chest feels full of words that need to be released, but you stop yourself because you've learned that expressing too much leads to misunderstanding, to dismissal, to distance. And so you carry those words inside you, letting them turn into quiet frustration, into unspoken pain. You find yourself craving conversations with other people, moments where you feel heard, moments where your words are acknowledged, moments where your presence feels valued, and that contrast becomes impossible to ignore because it shows you that the problem isn't your ability to connect, it's the environment you're trying to connect in. You start to feel invisible, not in the sense that you're ignored completely, but in the sense that your inner world goes unnoticed, your emotions go unrecognized, your depth goes unexplored, and that kind of invisibility is heavier than being alone because it happens right in front of someone who is supposed to see you the most. You sit in the same room, sharing the same space, but your minds feel miles apart, your emotional worlds completely disconnected, and no matter how much time you spend together, that gap doesn't close because time alone doesn't create connection, presence alone doesn't create understanding. You begin to miss being known, truly known, the kind of knowing that doesn't require explanation, the kind of understanding that feels effortless, the kind of connection that makes you feel safe to be exactly who you are, and realizing that this is missing creates a quiet sadness that stays with you even in moments that are supposed to feel happy. You notice how you hesitate before sharing something important, how you weigh whether it's even worth saying, how you prepare yourself for a response that might not meet you where you are, and that hesitation becomes a habit, a pattern of holding back that slowly builds walls between you and that. You know, you feel like you're carrying your emotional world alone, like everything that matters to you exists within you but has nowhere to go, nowhere to be fully expressed, nowhere to be fully received, and that isolation creates a kind of loneliness that doesn't depend on physical presence, it depends on emotional connection. There are nights where you feel it the most, where the silence feels louder, where the distance feels clearer, where you realize that despite being in a relationship, you're still facing your thoughts, your feelings, your struggles on your own without the support you expected to have. You try to convince yourself that it's temporary, that things will shift, that the connection will come back. But deep down, there's a growing awareness that this isn't just a phase, it's a pattern, and patterns don't change without something fundamental changing within the relationship. But you know, you weren't meant to feel alone in a place that was supposed to feel like home. You weren't meant to silence yourself to maintain peace. You weren't meant to question your need for connection, and recognizing that creates a quiet tension between what you're experiencing and what you know you deserve. And that tension stays with you in the quiet moments, in the empty conversations, in the space between words, reminding you that being physically close to someone is not the same as being emotionally connected. And without that connection, even the closest distance can feel like the farthest separation imaginable. For it doesn't begin with rules, it begins with suggestions, soft words that sound caring, gentle opinions that feel protective, a tone that makes you believe they're only looking out for you, and because it doesn't feel aggressive, because it doesn't feel forceful, you don't recognize it for what it is, you accept it, you consider it, you slowly start adjusting without realizing you're being guided into a version of yourself that is easier for them to manage. You know, they don't tell you what to do directly, they influence how you feel about what you want to do. They plant small doubts about your choices, about your friends, about your habits, until your decisions no longer feel entirely yours, until you start choosing differently, not because you've changed, but because you've been quietly steered. You hear things like, I just worry about you, or I don't think that's good for you, and it sounds reasonable. It sounds like care. But over time, those words start shaping your behavior. They start limiting your world, and you begin to filter your actions through their perspective instead of your own. You stop wearing certain things, not because they told you to, but because you know how they'll react. You avoid certain people, not because you don't value them, but because it creates tension. And this silent adjustment becomes a pattern where you're constantly anticipating their response before making a decision. It feels like compromise, it feels like understanding, it feels like you're being considerate, but there's a difference between choosing to adjust and feeling like you have to. And that difference is where control hides, in the space where your freedom quietly turns into obligation. You begin to explain yourself more than you used to, justifying your actions, your plans, your choices, as if you need permission to exist the way you naturally would. And that shift doesn't feel dramatic. It feels gradual, like something that just became normal without you noticing when it started. Your independence doesn't disappear all at once. It fades in pieces through moments where it feels easier to agree than to argue, easier to stay than to go, easier to align than to stand your ground. And every time you choose ease over authenticity, you give up a small part of your freedom. But, they might not stop you from doing things, but they make doing those things uncomfortable. They create an atmosphere where your choices come with emotional consequences, where you feel tension, guilt, or distance when you act outside their preferences, and that emotional pressure becomes more powerful than any direct command. You start to feel responsible for their reactions, like your actions are the reason they feel upset, disappointed, or distant, and that responsibility changes how you behave. It makes you more cautious, more controlled, more focused on maintaining their comfort than honoring your own needs. Your world becomes smaller, not because you wanted it to, but because it became easier that way. Fewer conflicts, fewer explanations, fewer moments where you feel like you're doing something wrong just by being yourself. And that reduction feels peaceful on the surface, but underneath it's limiting, it's restricting, it's quietly reshaping your life. But you begin to lose touch with what you actually enjoy, because your choices are no longer based on your preferences alone. They're influenced by how they might react, how they might feel, how it might affect the dynamic between you, and over time your desires become less clear, less defined, less present. It's not that they've taken control in an obvious way, it's that you've adapted in a way that gives them control without needing to ask for it. You've learned their patterns, their triggers, their expectations, and you've adjusted yourself to fit within them, creating a version of harmony that comes at the cost of your autonomy. You might even defend it, telling yourself this is what relationships require, that everyone makes compromises, that this is just part of being with someone, but deep down there's a quiet awareness that something feels off, that the balance isn't equal, that the adjustments are mostly happening on your side. There are moments where you feel the urge to do something freely, to act without considering their reaction, to make a decision based purely on what you want, but that urge is quickly followed by hesitation, by the thought of how it might affect things, and that hesitation becomes the barrier between you and your own freedom. You begin to second guess even simple choices, wondering if they align with what's expected, if they'll be approved of, if they'll create tension, and this constant awareness of their perspective becomes a lens through which you see your own life, distorting your sense of independence. The most powerful part of this kind of control is that it doesn't feel like control. It feels like adaptation. It feels like you're just being understanding, just being thoughtful, just being considerate. And because it feels like it's coming from you, it's harder to recognize that it's being shaped by someone else. But you might not realize how much has changed until you step back, until you remember how you used to be, how freely you moved, how confidently you decided, how naturally you expressed yourself, and that comparison reveals a shift that didn't happen overnight, but happened consistently enough to redefine your behavior. Your life starts revolving around maintaining a certain emotional balance, avoiding certain reactions, staying within certain boundaries that were never clearly stated but are clearly felt, and living within those boundaries becomes your new normal, even if it doesn't fully feel like you. And somewhere inside you there's a quiet recognition that you're not as free as you once were, that your choices don't feel entirely yours, that your life has been subtly reshaped, not through force, but through influence, not through commands, but through emotional pressure that guided you step by step into a space where control exists without ever needing to be declared. 5, it didn't start with pain. It started with something that felt rare, something that felt intense, something that made you believe you had found something different, and that beginning became the standard in your mind, the reference point you keep returning returning to, the memory you used to justify everything that followed. You remember how they looked at you, how they spoke to you, how everything felt effortless, how you didn't have to question anything. And those moments weren't just experiences, they became evidence, proof that what you felt was real, proof that this connection was worth holding on to, no matter what changed afterward. And when things started shifting, when the energy changed, when the connection became inconsistent, you didn't walk away, you leaned in, because your mind kept telling you that if it was real once, it can be real again, that something this strong doesn't just disappear, that it must still be there somewhere beneath the surface. You know, you begin to chase those early moments without realizing it, trying to recreate something that no longer exists in the same way, holding on to flashes of affection, small glimpses of what used to be, and using them as fuel to stay, as reasons to keep believing that things are just temporarily off, not permanently changed. You tell yourself stories to make it make sense. You say they're just stressed, they're going through something, they don't mean it, they'll come back to how they were, and every explanation you create becomes a layer between you and the truth, a layer that softens the reality enough for you to keep staying. You start thinking that if you just love them better, understand them more, be more patient, be more supportive, things will shift, things will improve, things will return to what they once were. And that belief puts all the responsibility on you, making you feel like the outcome depends on your effort. You begin to work harder emotionally, giving more, tolerating more, accepting things you never thought you would accept, because you're not responding to what is, you're responding to what was, to what you believe still has the potential to come back if you just hold on long enough. There are moments where you feel it clearly, where you see the pattern, where you recognize that things aren't changing, that the same issues keep repeating, that the same behaviors keep showing up. But instead of acting on that awareness, you quiet it with hope, telling yourself it just needs more time. Hope becomes your anchor, but it also becomes your trap, because it keeps you focused on a future that hasn't arrived while ignoring a present that keeps hurting you. And the longer you stay in that space, the more disconnected you become from what's actually happening. You hold on to the good moments like they're proof that everything else can be fixed, even when those moments become rare, even when they feel inconsistent, even when they don't carry the same depth anymore, because letting go of those moments would mean letting go of the entire belief you built around them. You start minimizing the negative, downplaying the things that hurt you, telling yourself they're not that bad, that every relationship has problems, that no one is perfect, and while those statements are true in general, they become dangerous when they're used to justify patterns that consistently take more from you than they give. You become attached not just to the person, but to the idea of who they could be, the version of them you experienced at the beginning, the version you still believe exists somewhere inside them, waiting to come back, and that attachment keeps you emotionally invested in something that isn't consistently present. You find yourself waiting for them to change, waiting for things to improve, waiting for the relationship to feel like it once did. And while you're waiting, time keeps passing, your energy keeps draining, your needs keep going unmet. But you stay because leaving would mean accepting that the change you hoped for isn't coming. You know, you start ignoring your own limits, pushing past your boundaries, staying in situations that don't feel right, because you've convinced yourself that endurance is part of love, that staying through difficulty proves your commitment, that walking away would mean giving up too soon. But deep down, there's a part of you that feels tired, not just from what's happening, but from the constant effort of holding on to something that doesn't feel stable anymore, from the emotional weight of believing in a version of reality that doesn't fully match your experience. You begin to feel the gap between what you hoped for and what you're living, and that gap creates tension, confusion, and quiet disappointment. Because no matter how much you try to close it, it doesn't close on its own. It stays there, reminding you that something isn't aligning. You might even start blaming yourself for the lack of change, wondering if you're not doing enough, not being enough, not trying hard enough, because it feels easier to believe that you can fix it than to accept that some things are beyond your control. But, and that belief keeps you stuck, because as long as you think the solution is in your hands, you'll keep trying, keep adjusting, keep staying, even when the reality in front of you shows no consistent sign of becoming what you're hoping for. You weren't meant to stay in a place where you have to rely on potential instead of reality. You weren't meant to hold on to someone based on who they used to be instead of who they are, and recognizing that creates a moment of clarity that feels uncomfortable but honest, a moment where hope starts to shift into awareness, where you begin to see that what you've been holding on to is not the relationship as it exists now, but the memory of what it once was.